In this roundup of a week, while big political events in the US capture attention, is the Republican Party gradually warming up to the idea of taking action on global warming? The UK announced that it's bringing forward the date for banning new petrol vehicles to 2035, and an Extinction Rebellion founder is videoed talking about abandoning nonviolence and embracing sabotage. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for changemakers. It's been hard to miss the big events in US politics this week. We've seen the Iowa caucuses, the State of the Union speech, and the inevitable and always obvious end to the impeachment saga. And you have to say that if you were someone inclined to bet on such things, you'd say that the prospects for a Trump re-election are looking pretty strong right now. It's hard to imagine a more disastrous week for the Democrats. The extraordinary political chaos of the Iowa caucus. I mean, you don't have to be a MAGA hat wearer to ask yourself at this point, really? We're going to put these people in charge of the country? It could turn out to be a blip. There's plenty of ground still to cover. But if you're a Democrat, it's been the worst possible start you could have asked for to the election. Then you had Trump actually staying on script and giving a perfectly decent State of the Union speech, pretty much in line with what these speeches tend to be in the year of an election. This was then immediately contrasted with Nancy Pelosi ripping up the speech behind his back. That's more the sort of issue that will split people on partisan lines, but a lot of those who are not in the trenches won't really be impressed with what seemed to be a fairly petty act. There have been many State of the Union speeches that the House speakers must have disagreed with throughout history. To make that sort of gesture doesn't give a good look. Will it be enough to overcome the years of random tweetings and antics by the president? Well, I don't know, maybe. Most of what President Trump is and does is now pretty much baked into the cake, whereas if the appeal of the other side is supposed to be being the opposite, then you have to behave like it. And in the absence of a standout moderate candidate, which is still the biggest problem, if it's Trump versus Bernie Sanders, then most will be predicting 4 more years of Trump. So the question then becomes, if there is 4 more years of Trump, does that mean 4 more years where nothing happens on climate change? And the answer to that question, well, it's no longer as obvious and solid as it once seemed. Over the last week, but really building over the last year, there have been growing signs that the Republican Party is stirring uneasily on the subject of climate change. Partly this is being driven by the realization that public opinion in America is shifting towards the perception that something needs to be done. A survey last November showed that 52% of millennial and younger Republicans felt that the government wasn't doing enough to reduce the impact of climate change. And that opinion is particularly spread through Republicans who you might see as the softer Republicans. In other words, the potential swing voters. 65% of Republican voters who identify as moderate or liberal agree that more needs to be done on climate change. And that matters for this coming election because Trump remains a deeply polarizing figure. Yes, he has a huge loyalty amongst his base, but there are lots on the margins who dislike his style, dislike his personality and all that comes with the Trump circus. And he doesn't play well with the younger voters. If they end up with a moderate Democrat alternative, that's a big if, but if they do, then there are no guarantees that those voters won't switch. So the party can't afford to be complacent, and that's leading some of the key House Democrats to believe that they need to begin guiding the party out of the self-imposed isolation on the issue. Now, this is something I've argued for ever since I started putting energy into this channel and did my first new style video on Jordan Peterson and climate change. The argument that if you think the extreme left, who currently boast ownership of the issue in the Democrats, are coming up with policies that would be disastrous for the country, then it's the right that needs to stop giving them the vacuum for those policies to fill. Come up with a well thought through policies to genuinely tackle the problem in a way that supports the economy and individual freedom and all of those things. And now we'll have the entirely positive benefit that it will challenge the bad policies on the other side to become more palatable. And that means that whoever wins, at least then they'll have policies that have been sharpened by competition into something that has a better chance of being helpful rather than damaging. But is there really any chance of that happening? Let's step back and look dispassionately on what's actually going on. Moves being advanced by Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and others are developing the themes for a clean energy innovation agenda, which is due to be released in the spring. Major themes of the agenda are thought to be capturing carbon dioxide through technology and planting trees, curbing plastic waste, exporting natural gas and promoting resilience or adaptation to sea level rise and other expected effects of climate change. Garrett Graves, who is the top Republican on the Select Climate Committee, said, "What we are asking our members to do is double down on what's actually worked to reduce emissions. And those are, by the way, conservative solutions. So it's not that we've gone out there to the Freedom Caucus to say, we're asking you to take a hard left turn." The strategy means rejecting carbon taxes and regulations in favour of repackaging support for tax subsidies and the funding of new science and technology. Now, of course, in the last 4 years, Trump has gone big in support of fossil fuels. And probably the one thing House Republicans politically can't do, if the attempt has any chance of success, is to come up with proposals that would require the president to back down on his public position, which has been reinforced time and time again. The attempted solution to that dilemma is to argue that the strategy will not be anti-fossil fuels. Instead, the emphasis will be on removing or reducing emissions. Fossil fuels aren't the enemy, Graves said. It's emissions. So let's devise strategies that are based on emissions strategies, not based on eliminating fossil fuels. It's an argument that's winning some supporters from previous skeptics. Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona, a member of the Freedom Caucus, was previously against, but now says he supports common sense solutions to combating climate change. Indeed, David Schweikert of Arizona says it's a natural position for Freedom Caucus members to support the climate agenda, given the growth of solar technology in Sunbelt states like his and wind power in rural conservative states. His argument was that conservatives had been unfairly and incorrectly defined as skeptics by Democrats. Although you have to think that President Trump has had a bit to do with that as well. You know, I think he might have given the impression once or twice in passing. In any case, Schweikert continues, "I am one of the founding members of the Freedom Caucus, and yet for years now, I've been doing presentations talking about the disruptive clean energy technology that is rolling out. That is a revolution that our brothers and sisters on the left don't want to know about because it blows up their control freak agenda." And that is such a potentially winning line. If you can get policies that people think are actually serious in tackling the problem, but stand in contrast to big government control freakery, that's going to be pretty popular in wider America. In December, Energy and Commerce Republicans unveiled a package of a dozen short-term bills to address climate change, including carbon capture, fourth-generation nuclear technology, and energy storage. These are just a starting point, but an early indication of the appetite for turning intention into action. And we've seen already mention of the 1 Trillion Trees project, promoted by Republican Bruce Westerman and referred to by Trump in his speech at the World Economic Forum. Now, for all of that, you have to add 2 notes of sober reality. The first is that although there may be a stirring of House Republicans to change tack on the issue, as you might expect at such an early stage, there are a lot more who remain emotionally vested in the opposite position. And the second is that by any objective view of the measures proposed, they fall short of what most independent and knowledgeable commentators would say was sufficient scale to actually tackle the problem. That isn't so much the point at this stage, since you have to win support for taking a first step before you're going to get the party ready to take a second. The fact that it's happening at all could represent the beginning of the turning of the tide. And remember, this isn't so much a new direction of travel as much as it is a resumption of what used to be the old direction. Some people have said that maybe this opens a way for more bipartisan initiatives in the future, but you're a long way from that at the moment, because right now the last thing the Democrats want to do is collaborate on an area that they believe they have made a distinctive part of their own appeal to voters. It actually has to be defused as an asset for either side before they do such a thing. Because yes, in spite of the rhetoric, both sides will look to party advantage first and foremost. Maybe they'll start to look more carefully at the net zero policies currently being pursued by the UK Conservative government as an example of a more far-reaching plan that can be supported by free marketeers. Spooky that you should mention that, because that's also very topical this week. Prime Minister Boris Johnson launched the countdown to the COP26 UN climate conference to take place in the UK later in the year. And he announced at the same time that the deadline for banning the sale of fossil-fueled cars is being brought forward by 5 years to 2035, which, as the motor industry companies quickly confirmed, is a non-trivial change. His speech, which was entirely playing to his favourite theme, expressed optimism that the problems ahead were all ones that could be solved with human ingenuity. He referred to the original inventor of an electric taxi, Walter Bursey, whose vehicle in 1897 was an early ancestor of the electric vehicles of today, but Johnson said was ultimately defeated by the sceptics of his age. And he said this: "So I say to all those who doubted Walter Bursey, eat your heart out, because his basic idea has triumphed, hasn't it? And the thing that they thought to be impossible has actually proved to be the solution." And he finished with, "The skeptics are wrong to doubt the Promethean genius of humanity to solve these problems. So we will crack it, and I hope that we can, as a planet and as a community of nations, get to net zero, as I say, within decades. We're going to do it by 2050. We're setting the pace. I hope everyone will come with us." And this, of course, was greeted with acclaim by UK environmentalists who are world renowned for their overwhelming optimism and faith in technology. Of course it wasn't. Greens said that the summit was heading for disaster, and the criticism was given some weight by the fact that shortly before the launch, the person who had been named as the president of the summit, former Environment Minister Claire O'Neill, formerly Claire Perry, was sacked. The rationale given was that since she stood down from Parliament at the election, it was now agreed that the role should be moved on to a current government minister. But it was also suggested by some that she hadn't proven to be capable as a figure in the early stages of preparations. And thus, as Johnson launched the summit, the news was rather distracted by the angry volley of criticism that she let fly in response to all of those briefings, saying that Boris Johnson didn't get climate change and the top-level committee that he promised to chair on the subject hadn't met since it was announced, and so on. All fuss and fury, the real work still lies ahead. What we don't know yet is who will step in to be the replacement president of the summit. Former Prime Minister David Cameron turned it down, probably on account of half of the world still blaming him for Brexit. Inevitably, speculation has been that it might be Michael Gove, who is the most senior minister in government that has demonstrated serious knowledge of and commitment to the issues. We'll find out soon, I expect. As for bringing forward the deadline for electric vehicles, manufacturers attacked it as being what they described as a date without a plan. As I noted before in the video I did on the Committee on Climate Change Technical Report, the chapter on transport, before you can mandate that the full fleet of vehicles on Britain's roads should be predominantly electric, you need to have a massive increase in the charging infrastructure nationwide, and you need to have upgraded the electricity grid to be able to provide all the additional electric power that will be needed. Simply announcing the deadline doesn't solve those pretty substantial problems. And at the very least, you're left looking with interest to see how much serious investment in solving that problem actually takes place. And some companies are seriously disadvantaged. Jaguar Land Rover, for instance, one of the few companies left making vehicles, still left actually in the UK, its larger vehicles are much more difficult to switch to electric. So the size of a challenge ahead is a major one for them. The chief executive of the Society for Motor Manufacturers and Traders, Mike Hawes, said this: "It's extremely concerning that government has seemingly moved the goalpost for consumers and industry on such a critical issue. Manufacturers are fully invested in a zero-emissions future, with some 60 plug-in models now on the market and 34 coming in 2020. However, with current demand for this still expensive technology still just a fraction of sales, it's clear that accelerating an already challenging ambition will take more than industry investment. A date without a plan will merely destroy value today." And it's a fair point. The CCC technical report explained all that needed to happen to enable this change to take place, and it was a good rationale for why net zero would take until 2050 rather than Extinction Rebellion's fantasy date of 2025. And when all the other parties were promising the same but quicker in their manifestos for the last general election, I was saying, sounds great, but where's the detail to explain how you're going to be able to do it faster? And it's still the relevant question. What changed? And the answer seems to be nothing. So it's not obvious what to make of the move, except possibly as a purely symbolic announcement to give the impression of commitment and momentum to go alongside the launch of COP26. And Extinction Rebellion, of course, dismissed it. But mostly they were taken up with some excitements of their own. A video had come to light with one of their founders, no, not the usual suspects, this one, Simon Bramwell. Now, it was only last week that I was referring to my early prediction that at some point some people would follow the logic of Extinction Rebellion's position to its ultimate logical conclusion and create a covert offshoot that would abandon the commitment to non-violence. And this came along the very next day. And it's not that. I don't think it's that. Although it sort of says that it is. What happened is that Bramwell was speaking at an event held by an organisation called Deep Green Resistance. This is a group that promotes what it describes as an active underground and believes that non-violence is not enough for what's needed. So that's who Bramwell is speaking to at a session titled "By Any Means Necessary," when he says this.
And this is up to all of us as well, like en masse, along with doing things like shutting down fossil fuel industries, direct sabotage, mass civil disobedience. We must also transform the myths that have got us here. The myths that we are in fact civilized. We are facing the hardest of times at the moment. Our civilization is displaying every sign of collapse, and because we have become so separated from nature, as that collapse occurs, that pent-up animal in us is going to be released in utter savagery. And it is part of our duty, in my opinion, that we've also got to not only take down civilization, but shepherd ourselves and the incoming generations back into a state of wilding, as it were, into like a feral consciousness. And I think that is also one of the biggest tasks remaining to us.
Now, I take two things from this. One, sadly, I take it as absolute confirmation that my earlier instincts were correct. And if you follow the logic of Extinction Rebellion's catastrophist positioning, it leads here. And sooner or later, some people will follow that train of logic, and at that point we enter a horrific cascade of consequences. Two, although I take this as confirmation of the principle, I'm not convinced that this is it actually happening right here, right now. For all the talk, this group doesn't seem like the sort of people who are going to have the courage to take it to that level. You have to be a particular brand of ruthless, motivated fanatic to go there. And these still look like hippies trying to get their heads around stuff. Maybe I'm wrong, but I hope not, for their sake and for the sake of the issue that they believe that they're acting on behalf of. However, none of that particularly bothers Extinction Rebellion. When asked about Bramwell's comments about direct sabotage, they just said, "Simon's views as expressed in this video do not represent the position of Extinction Rebellion as a whole," which is obviously not quite the same as them condemning those views. What does bother them is that when this came to light, an LBC radio host, Nick Ferrari, said that enough was enough, and he launched a campaign to give police new powers to enable them to deal with protests that involve serious disorder. This was done as Extinction Rebellion announced that it would have its next big action on May the 23rd. My birthday. You shouldn't have. No, really, you shouldn't have. And of course, Ferrari says that this is not about the right to peacefully protest, which is an absolute right that we support in the UK. It's about the organised, deliberate, illegal actions designed to disrupt the lives of ordinary people, carried out by those who say they want to bring down society. Extinction Rebellion, on the other hand, jump up and down and say, this is the suppression of legitimate protest, and so on, round and round. I don't think you can brush the Simon Bramwell thing off that easily. If you tell young people that they will die of climate change, not old age, which is not what the science says, then you create the circumstances where people would naturally feel they should move to the next level if the original protests don't work. And those protests can't work because they're focused on impossible demands. I say this to Extinction Rebellion in all seriousness. If we see the emergence of a violent splinter group on climate change, you'll disavow it, I'm sure, but it will be on you. As I've been pointing out for the last 12 months, it's the logical endpoint of how you've gone about the campaign to date. Take it seriously. All right. Just time for some things that I like and one thing that I don't. The first thing that I like: the new chief executive of fashion chain H&M has been appointed, a woman called Helena Helmerson. Why is that of interest? Only that I think she's the first chief executive of a major corporation of the size and importance of H&M who for a significant period of her career with the company was its sustainability manager. She was sustainability manager between 2010 and 2015 before becoming overall head of production. In theory, taking the sustainability role should be a great platform for a business leader because it exposes you to all the different parts of a business and how it works. At least it does if you do the job right. But it's certainly very unusual. H&M is committed to some pretty radical plans for a fast fashion giant. It's aiming to become a fully circular business by 2030, which means it gets to zero waste, and climate positive by 2040. That's hard for many businesses, but a lot harder for fast fashion. And of course you have to do all of that by keeping the business a thriving and successful business, with by no means, in H&M's case, an eco-niche base of customers. So good luck to her and to them. The second thing I like, in today's Times, the UK's Secretary of State for Education, Gavin Williamson, puts down a warning to the universities that they have to stand up for freedom of speech. And if they're going to refuse to do that, then the government will step in to require it. This comes after a number of cases, not as bad as some in the US and Canada universities, but getting close, of speakers with views that fall outside the woke standard for the academic left being deplatformed in various ways, so that students don't get to hear views that fall outside of a certain range. If you ask them, the students themselves say that they do want to hear different views, and it's just an aggressive and vocal minority that aims to get events cancelled by threatening violent protest. This is absolutely what government should be doing, ensuring voices get heard, not shut down. Good for Gavin Williamson. And then one thing that I don't like. If you ever wanted to see a vision of what Extinction Rebellion and most recently at the World Economic Forum Greta Thunberg mean when they say that they want to see real zero carbon, not net zero carbon, there's a new report that was released this week. This was quoted as suggesting that technology had to be discounted as a potential source of improvements. No carbon capture, no offsetting. Clean tech won't solve warming in time. It sounds as though that's a conclusion of a definitive study. It isn't. It's a position based on traditional environmentalist preferences, but they have gone to great lengths to work out what absolute zero would actually look like. And this is it. This is their vision of what we should do. 2020 to 2029, all airports except Heathrow, Glasgow and Belfast close. 2030 to 2049, all remaining airports close, no flying whatsoever by 2050. 2030 to 2049, all shipping declines to zero. 2050, no shipping whatsoever. New non-electric vehicles banned almost immediately. By 2050, road use only at 60% of 2020 levels because, I don't know, everyone's lost the will to live and can't be bothered to travel anywhere. Next 10 years, national consumption of beef and lamb to drop by 50%. Reduction in frozen ready meals. But that's just softening you up, because then after that, beef and lamb is banned entirely. Fertilizer use is greatly reduced, which is odd because we're going to need to grow a bunch more vegetables. Where did all this come from? They tell you. The authors of this report are funded by the UK government to support businesses and governments, national and regional, to develop a future industrial strategy that's compatible with zero emissions. Great! Our tax money. Was it the brief to come up with a plan that would get the government removed from power in the shortest possible time? Or was that your idea? We don't have the time to go into all the different ways that this is complete garbage. Why anyone would think that developing technologies that are generally supported by many players with serious money to invest and technology in progress is definitely not going to deliver, but a program that no population would ever support at the ballot box would be better and quicker and easier to deliver? Well, yeah, maybe. If you're a modern Chairman Mao and you can just impose your will on everybody, because we remember how well that always used to work out. But I'm left with a question. How can you launch this report and have the BBC reporting on it in a way that skips over these details, which would immediately and obviously tell people that this is complete garbage, and focus instead on the false message that some researchers have seriously looked into the work that's going on and come to a considered conclusion that none of the technology will deliver the progress that we need? We'll leave that question hanging in the air. My name is Mallen Baker. This is The Mallen Baker Show.